The nameplate on my cottage door was not there when I left for work on a Tuesday morning. It was there when I came back. A small rectangle of carved oak, maybe 6 inches across, my name cut into it in clean, careful letters. Caleb Merritt. Not a company plaque. Not something from the estate office. The grain of the wood had been sanded smooth. The letters darkened with a wood-burning tool, and in the bottom right corner, so small I almost missed it, a single sprig of lavender had been pressed and sealed into the varnish. I stood on my doorstep holding my work gloves and staring at it for a long time. I didn't know who had left it. I told myself it was probably Mrs. Renner from the estate office, one of those small gestures the staff made when someone had worked a difficult season. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that for 6 weeks. I didn't know yet that the same person who carved that nameplate had already answered a question I hadn't been asked. That while I was down in the lower field fixing the drainage pipe and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the frost would come early, she was sitting in a room with her father, listening to a proposal that had my name in it, and saying yes. My name is Caleb Merritt. I'm 31 years old and I've been the head groundskeeper and estate manager at Hale House in Millhaven, Vermont for 4 years. Before that, I worked landscape maintenance for a landscaping company out of Burlington. Before that, I worked whatever I could find. I didn't come from money. I didn't go to college. I know how to read a soil sample, how to reroute drainage before a hard winter, how to keep 3 acres of perennial garden looking like something out of a painting without a staff of 6. I know when a fence post is going to fail before it fails. I know that the stone wall on the east boundary needs repointing every 3 years, and that if you let the ivy go one more season without cutting it back, it starts working into the mortar. Harold Hale hired me because the last groundskeeper had let the property slide for 2 seasons, and Harold had standards. He showed me around the estate on a gray October morning with his hands in his coat pockets, not saying much, just watching me. At the end of the walk, he looked at the overgrown rose garden and asked what I would do with it. I told him. He said, "Start Monday." That was the beginning. Harold was not a warm man. He was fair, exacting, and he paid on time, which in my experience puts him ahead of most. He left me alone to do the work and acknowledged when it was done well by not complaining, which is the closest some men get to praise. We got along in the way that 2 quiet people with high standards sometimes do. We didn't spend time together outside of work. We didn't eat meals. We didn't talk about our lives. I didn't know he had a daughter at the estate for the first 8 months, because Nora Hale spent most of the year in Providence, where she taught drawing and watercolor at a small private art school. She came back to Millhaven in the summers, and the first summer she was there I barely saw her. A woman with dark hair moving through the greenhouse at odd hours, sometimes carrying a sketchbook, sometimes carrying nothing at all. She didn't talk to me. I didn't talk to her. My life outside of work was small. I lived in the stone cottage at the edge of the estate grounds, 40 steps from the greenhouse and close enough to the main property that I could hear if anything went wrong in the night. I cooked simple meals. I read in the evenings. My mother had died 18 months before I started at Hale House, a slow illness that took 2 years to finish what it started. She was the last family I had. My father had been gone since I was 17. Not dead, just gone, which is a different kind of gone and in some ways harder. I had stopped expecting people to choose me, not in a bitter way, just in the way that a man learns over enough years what he is to the world. I was useful. I was reliable. I showed up and I stayed and I did what needed to be done. But reliable isn't the same as chosen, and I had learned the difference. The wound was quiet. It didn't announce itself. It just lived in the back of my chest like a room I had stopped going into, and I told myself I had made my peace with it. I hadn't. The second summer, Nora came back earlier. Late April, when the last of the frost was still threatening the tulip beds and the greenhouse heaters were running nights. I came in at 6:30 on a Thursday morning to check the seedling trays, and she was already there. Standing at the long wooden table in the center of the greenhouse, an open sketchbook in front of her, drawing the tomato seedlings with the focused stillness of someone who had been there for a while. She looked up when I came in. "Sorry," she said. "I'll be out of your way." "You're not in my way," I told her. She nodded once, looked back at her sketchbook, and kept drawing. I went to check the seedlings. She stayed at the table. We worked in the same space for 40 minutes without speaking, and it wasn't awkward. That surprised me. Most people, when they're somewhere they feel uncertain, fill the silence. She didn't. When I finished, I carried the first trays to the back bench, and she had already moved the second set of trays to make room without being asked. She had understood the system from watching. "Thank you," I said. "You're doing it in groups of 12, she answered, not looking up. By variety, I figured. I didn't say anything else. I picked up my clipboard and left. That evening, walking back to the cottage, I thought about the way she had read the pattern in what I was doing and acted on it without needing to explain herself. It seemed like a small thing. It wasn't. After that, she was in the greenhouse most mornings when I arrived, sometimes sketching, sometimes reading. Once trimming the deadwood off the rosemary bushes with a pair of small clippers she had apparently found in the tool cabinet, doing it correctly, which told me she had either been taught or had figured it out on her own. I suspected the latter. She started talking to me in small increments. The way plants do, I thought later, not in a rush, but a little further each time. She asked about the soil composition in the east garden. I told her. She asked why I used bone meal in the rose beds and not the perennial border. I explained it. She listened without nodding, which meant she was actually listening and not just waiting for me to stop. She asked follow-up questions that proved she had retained what I said. On a rainy Friday in May, she brought coffee to the greenhouse. 2 mugs. She set one on the edge of the bench near where I was working without a word and took her own to the table. I noticed she took it the same way I did. Black, no sugar. I noticed I had noticed. By the end of May, her presence in the mornings had become something I planned around without meaning to. If I was going to be in the east garden before 7, I moved the greenhouse work to after 9. I told myself it was about efficiency. It wasn't. She talked to me about her work in Providence sometimes. The students she taught. The difficulty of teaching someone to see rather than just to look. She said that most people drew what they thought a thing looked like rather than what it actually looked like, and the only way to correct that was to slow them down until the eye could catch up to the habit. "Is that teachable?" I asked. "That kind of slowing down," she considered it. She always considered things before she answered, which I had come to understand was not hesitation but precision. "For some people," she said, "for some people the habit is too deep. They keep drawing the idea of the flower instead of the flower itself." A pause. "But sometimes you see someone change. You see the moment the real thing comes through. It's the best thing in the world, honestly." She was looking at the tomato vines when she said it, tracing one of them with a fingertip without quite touching the leaf. I went back to work without answering, and later that evening I thought about what she had said for longer than I intended. One evening in mid-June, I was replacing a section of the greenhouse bench frame, dry rot at the joint. I had caught it just before it became serious, and she sat on the opposite bench watching me work. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear and her sketchbook open in her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was watching my hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "How do you know when something's worth saving versus when you should just replace it?" I looked at the joint I was working on. The old wood around the rot was still solid. I had tested it before I started. "You see how much of the original structure you can keep," I said. "If there's enough, you build around what's already there. You don't tear it out unless you have to." She wrote something in the sketchbook. I didn't ask what. One morning, around the 3rd week of June, she was standing at the far end of the greenhouse looking out at the rain on the glass. She had her arms crossed and her sketchbook tucked under one elbow, and there was something in the line of her shoulders that made me stop what I was doing. "You all right?" I asked. She turned around slowly. Her eyes were clear, not sad, but there was something in them I couldn't quite name, like she was working something out. "I keep thinking about what you said last week," she told me. "About how the soil here has a memory, how it takes years to change what the land has learned." I had said that. I hadn't expected her to carry it. "I think people are like that too," she said, "slow to change what they've always known about themselves." I didn't answer right away. The rain tapped steadily on the glass above us. "Takes the right conditions," I said finally. She looked at me for a moment that lasted one beat longer than ordinary conversation allows. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it does." Then she looked back at the rain, and whatever was happening between us stayed unnamed, because neither of us reached for it yet. Harold called me into his study on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July. I had been in the study twice in 4 years, once when he hired me, once when he needed to discuss the budget for the east wall restoration. It was a room that felt like a man's idea of himself. Dark wood framed maps of the property going back 150 years, a desk that had probably cost more than my truck. He was standing when I came in. That was the first thing I noticed. Harold Hale had the posture of a man who did not sit unless he had made a deliberate decision to do so, but today there was something different in the way he stood, a stiffness that wasn't authority. He looked older than he had in the spring. "Sit down, Caleb." I sat. He didn't. He walked to the window, looked out at the grounds, and was quiet long enough that I started to wonder if I had done something wrong without knowing it. "I'm going to tell you something," he said at last, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." "All right." He turned from the window. "I have a heart condition. The doctors have been managing it for 2 years, but it has progressed faster than they expected. I likely have a year, possibly less." He said it the way a man announces a change in weather. Flat, factual. I have not told Nora. I stayed very still. I will tell her eventually, but first I need to deal with something. There is a clause in my father's will governing the estate. Nora must be married by the age of 30 or the property passes to my cousin Robert's line. He said Robert's name with a compression in his jaw that told me everything about what he thought of Robert. Nora turns 30 in 14 months. He sat down then in the chair behind the desk and looked at me directly. "I have watched you for 4 years. I know how you work. I know what you care about even when you don't say it. And I have watched my daughter with you this summer." A pause. "I am not a sentimental man, and I am not asking you to perform a transaction. I am asking you to consider a marriage. If you marry Nora and she accepts, she keeps the estate. You will also receive a portion of the estate in your own name, a real portion. Not a token." He named a portion. It was real. "I know this is not a conventional conversation," he said, "and I know what you're thinking, that I am using you to solve a problem. You are not wrong about the problem, but I have lived long enough to know that the worst marriages are the ones made for love alone, and the best ones are the ones where two people have the right kind of respect for each other before they begin." The room was very quiet. "I am not ordering you," he said. "I am asking. You would need to be willing, and Nora would need to be willing. I plan to speak to her after I speak to you." I looked at him for a long time, the maps behind him, the gray light through the windows. "What if she isn't willing?" I asked. Something moved across Harold Hale's face. Something I couldn't read entirely, but it looked, for just a moment, like a father who loved his daughter so much it had warped the shape of his judgment. "Then I will have to find another way," he said. "But I wanted to ask you first." I stood up. "I'll think on it." He nodded once. As I reached the door, he spoke again, quiet. "She is the best thing I have ever done, Caleb, the only thing that has ever really mattered. I need to know she'll be all right when I'm gone." I walked out into the afternoon light and stood on the stone steps for a long time looking at the greenhouse. The glass was still wet from the morning's rain. I had not said yes. I had not said no. But I had said I would think on it, and somewhere in the 4 years I had spent on this land, I had stopped being a man who made promises he didn't intend to keep. I went back to work. There was a section of fence along the north boundary that needed new posts sunk before the ground hardened again. I drove posts for 2 hours in the afternoon light, thinking about nothing and everything at once, and when I walked back to the cottage at dusk, the grounds were quiet and the main house was lit from the inside, warm and distant, and I thought about Harold sitting in that study with his maps and his dying heart, trying to arrange things he couldn't control. I thought about my father, who had faced a hard thing and walked away from it. Different men handle fear differently. I had spent years understanding that the walking away kind was not the only kind. I didn't sleep well for 3 nights. The facts arranged themselves in my head and I kept turning them, looking for the angle that made it simple. There wasn't one. I knew what Harold was doing. He was making a business arrangement dressed in the clothes of something else. I had been on the receiving end of those before, and I knew better than to mistake the clothes for the thing underneath. He was a dying man trying to solve a problem that love alone had not solved, because love alone had not been enough to give his daughter the right kind of protection. I understood that. I even respected it. What I couldn't settle was Nora. I had watched her this summer the way you watch something you're afraid to want. The way she listened. The weight she put on small things that most people let fall. The coffee she brought without ceremony, the way she moved through the greenhouse like she belonged to it, the look on her face on rainy mornings when she said things that mattered without seeming to know they mattered. She didn't know I had been asked. Harold had said he would speak to her after me. But on the fourth morning I came to the greenhouse at 6:15 and Nora was not there. She wasn't there at 7 or 8. By 9 I was certain something had shifted. At noon, I was replacing a cracked pane of glass at the south end of the greenhouse when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I turned. Nora walked toward me in the noon light, her hair loose, her hands in the front pocket of her jacket. She stopped 10 feet away and looked at me with eyes that were direct and steady and carrying something I couldn't name. "My father spoke to you," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." She nodded slowly, looking down at the gravel, then back up. "He spoke to me last night." A pause. "He told me about his heart. He told me about the will." Another pause, slower. "He told me about you." I waited. She looked at me in the way she had that morning in the greenhouse when she said people are slow to change what they've always known about themselves. "I want you to know something," she said. "What my father did, the arrangement, the offer, that's his. That's his fear and his love and his way of managing things he can't control." She stopped. "But my answer isn't his." My chest was very tight. "What is your answer?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was warm and still, and the greenhouse glass caught the light behind her. "I've been watching you for a year and a half," she said. "Since the summer I came back early and found you in the greenhouse at 6 in the morning checking seedlings like each one mattered on its own." She wasn't rushing the words. They came out like something that had been lived in before being spoken. "You have never once made me feel like a problem to be managed. You have never been cruel or careless or lazy. You don't perform goodness, you just are it." She looked at him steadily. "My father asked you because he's desperate and he's dying and he loves me imperfectly. But I'm not saying yes because of the estate." I couldn't speak. "I'm saying yes because when I thought about a life without you in it, it felt smaller." She stopped. Then quietly, the way a person says the truest thing they know. "I already said yes, Caleb. Before you gave me your answer, I already said yes." The afternoon went still. I could hear the greenhouse heaters. I could hear my own heartbeat. The cracked pane of glass was in my hands and I had forgotten it was there. I set it down on the gravel carefully, like something that required attention, because I needed a moment before I could speak. The afternoon light fell across her face and the gravel and the old stone wall behind her, and I stood there with nothing in my hands and felt something in me shift the way the soil shifts in a slow thaw, not loud, not sudden, just the undeniable movement of something that had been frozen for a very long time beginning, at last, to open. I set the glass down. I walked the 10 feet between us. I stopped close enough that I could see the steadiness in her eyes, the way she was holding her breath without moving, waiting for me to say something. "I wasn't going to say yes because of the estate either," I told her. "I was going to say yes because of you. I just didn't know if I had the right." She exhaled slowly. "You do," she said. "You have for a while. I was hoping you would figure it out." We stood there in the noon sun without touching for another moment, and then something loosened between us, all the careful distance, all the unnamed things from the past year and a half, and she stepped forward and I put my arms around her and she rested her forehead against my shoulder and we stayed like that while the greenhouse glass went bright above us. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no audience, no one clapping. Just two quiet people who had been moving toward each other for longer than either of us had admitted, finally standing still enough to arrive. Harold made it 9 more months. He told the estate staff in August, after Nora and I had had our civil ceremony at the courthouse in Millhaven. It was a small thing, 2 witnesses, a judge, a walk to the diner afterward for coffee. Nora wore a blue dress the color of the greenhouse light on a clear morning. I wore a clean shirt and the good jacket I had bought 3 years ago and barely touched since. Harold sat at the table at the diner and looked at the two of us, and in that moment I saw past the composed exterior he had worn every day I'd known him. He looked tired and relieved and very much like a father who had been afraid for a long time and had finally set down something heavy. "Thank you," he said to me, quietly, not performing anything. "You don't have to thank me," I told him. "I'm here because I want to be." He looked at his daughter. She was reading the back of the menu even though she knew it by heart, giving us a moment. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." The months that followed were not easy, but they had a shape I could hold. Nora moved into the cottage with me. We were too close to the main house in some ways and too far from everything else, but neither of us wanted to change it. The cottage was small and warm and full of her sketches. There was always coffee ready in the morning. The kitchen table had 2 cups on it now instead of one. She kept some of her things on the windowsill above the sink, a small ceramic bowl, a handful of dried lavender, 3 stones she had picked up from the property wall. Things that cost nothing and meant something. I left space for them without being asked. She noticed, and she didn't say anything about it, and that was exactly right. We worked the estate together in a way that felt natural. She handled the staff communications and the letters from the Historic Preservation Board, and I handled the grounds. But there was crossover. She came down to the greenhouse in the afternoon sometimes, not to draw now, but to work. She had learned how to thin seedlings properly, how to check the moisture in the growing beds by pressing her palm flat against the soil. She still asked questions. They were better questions than before. In the evenings, we sat in the cottage and she sketched and I read, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and both felt like the same kind of company. Harold came for dinner twice in August. He sat at our kitchen table and ate the meal Nora had made and looked at the two of us with an expression I had seen before and finally understood. It was the look of a man trying to memorize a room. He knew he was running out of time to see it. I watched Nora become the person who ran Hale House, and she was good at it in ways Harold had never been. Where he had managed through authority, she managed through attention. She knew every staff member's name and what they needed. She walked the property the way I walked it, not to inspect, but to understand. Harold declined slowly, then faster. In his last weeks, Nora sat with him most evenings. I stayed near but not close, giving them the space they needed. One evening she came back to the cottage after midnight and sat down at the kitchen table without saying anything, and I made tea and sat across from her, and we were quiet together for a long time. "He keeps apologizing," she said finally, "for the way he arranged things, for not telling me sooner, for being so afraid he made it into a transaction." I held the mug in both hands. "What do you tell him?" She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I tell him that I understand being so afraid of losing someone that you do desperate things. I tell him that I forgave him before he asked, and that the thing he was most afraid of didn't happen, that I'm not alone." A pause. "He cries," she said. "He's not a crying man. It breaks my heart a little." I reached across the table and rested my hand over hers. "He did a clumsy thing for the right reason," I said. "That seems like most of what loving someone is if you do it long enough." She looked at my hand on hers for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and held it. "I think you're right," she said. "I think he was just so scared. The fear of losing the person you love most. Making decisions out of that fear that look from the outside like control. I thought about my father who had left rather than face his own fear. I thought about Harold who had done the opposite, who had pulled hard and badly toward what he loved instead of away from it. 2 different failures of the same thing. 2 different faces of the same terror. I didn't say this to Nora, but I felt it settle in me like soil learning something new. Harold passed in early spring, on a clear morning when the frost was still on the grass and the light was thin and bright. Nora was with him. She came to find me in the greenhouse afterward. I heard her come in and turned around. She looked small and real and exhausted, and she walked straight to me, and I held her for a long time without speaking while the light came through the glass above us. The reading of the will was handled by the estate lawyer, a composed woman named Patricia who had worked with the Hale family for 20 years. She went through it carefully, clearly, and when she was finished, Robert's cousin looked across the table with the expression of a man who had expected a different outcome. The estate passed to Nora in full. Legally clearly, with no grounds for contest. Robert said something about the nature of the marriage arrangement, something about whether the terms had been met in good faith. Patricia looked at him over her glasses and said, with the calm of a woman who had seen every kind of desperation a family name could produce, that the marriage was legal, verifiable, and in her professional opinion, not the arrangement of two people performing anything. She said she had known Harold Hale for 20 years and she would like to think she could recognize genuine feeling in a room. Robert left without shaking anyone's hand. Nora walked out into the afternoon light and stood on the stone steps, her coat on, looking out at the property that was now hers. I stood beside her. "How do you feel?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The bare trees along the east boundary, the long lawn still brown from winter, the greenhouse glinting in the pale March sun. "Like I could stop holding my breath," she said. "I understood that." "What do you want to do with it?" I asked. "The estate." She looked over at me, something warm and certain in her eyes. "I want to make it something my father never managed to," she said. "Something actually alive, open to people." She looked back at the grounds. "I want to use the west field for community garden plots. I want to expand the greenhouse and do workshops. I want the stone cottage to stay exactly as it is." The last part made me smile. She saw it. "What?" she asked. "That last part." She leaned against my shoulder just slightly. "That last part is non-negotiable." We stood there on the stone steps while the afternoon went long and still around us, and I thought about the morning I had come home to find a small carved nameplate on my door, the lavender sprig sealed into the varnish, my own name in clean, careful letters. I had told myself it meant nothing. I had been so profoundly wrong. We had a second ceremony that October, the kind we had always planned to have but pushed back while Harold was declining. Nothing elaborate. A Saturday afternoon in the restored walled garden, 40 people, strings of simple lights through the old apple trees, a long table with food from the estate's own kitchen. Nora wore a dress she had sketched herself and had made by a seamstress in town. I wore a suit that fit properly, which was a first. Her friend from Providence gave a short speech that made 3 people cry and everyone else laugh. My old crew foreman from Burlington, one of the last people who had known my mother, sat in the front row and shook my hand afterward with both of his and didn't say anything, just nodded, which was exactly right. When the evening wound down and the last guests were leaving, Nora and I walked through the greenhouse. Just the two of us. The low evening light came through the glass at an angle and turned everything gold. She stopped at the long wooden table in the center, the same table where I had watched her drawing seedlings on a rainy morning 2.5 years ago. "This is where it started," she said. "Earlier than that," I told her. "But this is where I started to know it." She turned to face me. "What took you so long?" she asked, and she was smiling, but she meant it too. I thought about that for a moment, about the room I had locked inside myself and stopped going into, about the man who had learned not to expect to be chosen, about the months I had watched her in this greenhouse and told myself I was imagining the weight of what passed between us. "I didn't think I was the kind of man someone chose freely," I said. "I thought I was the kind of man someone used and moved on from." Nora looked at me with eyes that were steady and warm and seeing me completely. "I know," she said. "I could see that in you from the beginning. It was the thing that made me want to prove you wrong most." She reached up and touched my face just briefly, the way she sometimes did when she had something to say and words weren't quite enough. "You are the kind of man someone chooses freely," she said. "You have always been that, you just needed someone to say it out loud." I held her hand against my face for a moment. "You did," I said, "in a courtyard in the middle of the afternoon with a cracked pane of glass in my hands." She laughed. The sound of it filled the greenhouse the way light fills water, quietly, thoroughly, completely. "I did," she agreed, "and I'd say it again. The nameplate is still on the cottage door. I have looked at it every morning for 2 years now, going out into the grounds at first light when the air is cold and the greenhouse glass catches the early sun. I used to stand at the door and wonder what kind of man I was to the world. I used to leave for work and come home to a silence that asked nothing and gave nothing back. Now there is coffee on the kitchen table in the morning. There is a sketchbook on the windowsill and a pair of work gloves on the front step, and the sound of someone moving around in the next room. Unhurried, certain, belonging exactly where she is. Nora put her name beside mine on the nameplate last spring. She added it below, in the same careful letters, with a second sprig of lavender pressed into the varnish. I don't know where we'll be in 20 years. I don't know what the estate will become or how the land will change or what Harold, wherever he is, makes of all of it. I hope he rests easy. I think he does. What I know is this. There is a stone cottage at the edge of a property in Millhaven, Vermont, with 2 names on the door and 2 cups on the kitchen table and a greenhouse where 2 people started talking about soil and memory, and slowly, carefully, without rushing any of it, found their way toward each other. I know what it felt like to live in a house with no one to come home to. I know the particular quiet of a life that asks very little because it has learned to expect very little. I know the room you stop going into and how you tell yourself you have made your peace with it. I know what it feels like when that room opens. It doesn't feel like fireworks. It doesn't feel like rescue. It feels like someone carving your name into a piece of wood and pressing a sprig of lavender into the varnish and leaving it on your door without explanation because the answer was already decided before the question was asked. Some things know what they are long before we do. I was just the last one in the room to understand.